I'm Anja Lundbeck. I'm your host today, and welcome to our Feminine Futures webinar series. You will have seen probably that it's 7 episodes, and we're kicking it off today with Helena Norberg-Hodge. I'll be introducing her in a minute. So I'd like to introduce our first speakers in the series, Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena, are you with us? Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures, which is the organization that is hosting this webinar series. And both Anja and I are also from Local Futures, the two Anjas, sitting in different parts of the world. I'm in Mexico. Anja Light is in Australia, and Helena Norberg-Hodge is really a pioneer of what is now a worldwide localization movement. And she's got 50 years of experience, starting way back in Ladakh in India, and she will be sharing about that today in this series, which is about rethinking progress from a feminine living world perspective. And Helena's webinar, Resisting Globally and Renewing Locally, the format will be that Helena will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. So Helena, we're so happy to start this. We're very excited about starting this webinar series, and afterwards, hopefully we can see where people are from, and that you can add that in the chat box as soon as Anja Light has got that sorted. And Helena, over to you. So I'll be disappearing off.
Anja Lundbeck is the one who's organized all of this, so a big thank you. It's an amazing amount of work, and Anja Light, who just went away, has been helping to promote it. And we had more than 700 people signing up. Let's start with just taking a breath and being here now. And I like to combine that with urging us all to just have a deep gratitude for the land, the living earth that is sacred everywhere. And I also like to express gratitude to all the indigenous peoples who lived in harmony with that land for thousands of years. And I'm hoping that we can learn meaningful lessons from that to take into our future. And for me, those meaningful lessons were expressed in my book, Ancient Futures. So I was saying that in these ancient cultures, there were deep lessons, not just about how we can be more sustainable, but how we can be more happy, and healthy, physically healthy, emotionally healthy, and how we can bring children into this world who have the love that every one of us needs as a child. So a lot of what I've tried to share in Ancient Futures, and later I realized that Ancient Futures are fundamentally local futures. Why are they local? Because we need the deep, direct, face-to-face, touch experience of one another and of nature. We need to come back to being much more place-based. That doesn't mean not being connected globally or supportive, collaborating internationally, but it means that for the foundations of our well-being, we need the local. I have to say that in the first years of my work, I used to be surprised by how many women responded to what I said, because I was never talking specifically about women, but I was talking about the fundamentals of basic joy and health and well-being, and women responded much more. So I've realized that ancient futures or local futures are feminine futures. So how and why is that? Well, it turns out that the sensibility, the sensitivity to the deeper connections between humans and between humans and nature are more deeply felt by women. Now I'm going to be saying things that in today's intellectual climate are becoming controversial, but I really hope that with love and wisdom, we can reclaim the right to recognize that male and female are different. Doesn't mean that there aren't people who are, again, not fitting into some absolute categories. These categories are not absolute, but they are a pattern, which, as it turns out, many of you may know that my experience of all of this came from Ladakh or Little Tibet. So I should actually preface everything I say with this is really coming from 40 years of close, intimate experience of an ancient indigenous culture. So when I speak, it's not coming from me and my ideas, this is what I think. It's coming from sharing experiences that were very unusual in that this culture was so unusual. They were so lucky to have been up at 12,000 feet, surrounded by high Himalayan mountains. And partly because of that, the colonizers did not manage to destroy their culture. And even more importantly, maybe because of this, they developed a Buddhist religion which reinforced the indigenous. It didn't destroy the indigenous. So somehow they're quite sophisticated, quite modern, if you like, philosophy that is in harmony with quantum physics. That Buddhist religion supported ancient nature-based feminine wisdom. And that meant that when Christian missionaries came, and they tried, they came from, I think, I don't remember the very first, but I know they were there in the 1600s. And year after year, missionaries came, but they only converted a few orphans. Now, this was so unusual because in so many cultures, in the most remote Papua New Guinea and all over the world, the missionaries basically told people, you're inferior, you're backward, you better comply with what we are telling you, our version, because you are inferior, you are primitive. And part of what Christianity did, and I'm not at all trying to create an anti-Christian argument, because there are so many good Christians supporting very good values, but Christianity did tend to paint a view of the world that I can't subscribe to, which was that the human and the earth were separate from the spiritual, and the spiritual was up in the sky. It was clean, it was pure. What the indigenous people all over the world believed was that all of life was sacred. The water was sacred, the trees are sacred. You and I are part of a sacred web, an interdependent web. So now I deviated from what I was starting to talk about, which was the differences between male and female. And again, remember, please realize I would never have the arrogance. I don't think, no, I'm sure I wouldn't have the arrogance to sit here telling you, well, I know, male and female are different, and take my word for it. But I was going to tell you that in the books which the Tibetans had, and the Ladakhis were part of this Tibetan culture, books that go back more than 1,000 years, they talk about the differences between male and female. And of course, in an all-inclusive way, it's not demonizing one or the other. But those differences include a greater sensitivity to the social and to the fabric of life. And this is what I want us to think about and talk about. And what I experienced in that ancient culture is that little boys were encouraged to maintain their feminine. So clearly, there are differences, pattern differences, not absolute. Can't draw a line around any boy or girl and say this is no, but there's a pattern difference that if we're sensitive to it, we can learn a lot. And we really by now should have learned that a lot of what's wrong in the world today is because of what is called a patriarchal colonial system. And that patriarchal colonial system that started in Europe with white men, that was building on what Christianity had done. And let's remember that Christianity tragically believed that the women who had nature-based spiritual knowledge and that in a decentralized, localized, feminine way, reminded people of our inextricable interdependence with all of life, and that had practices, rituals, songs, dances that helped traditions keep that understanding alive in nature. Now, those women were burned at the stake, they were stoned. And I only learned literally this year that the first book of the printing press apparently was about these terrible witches. So at a very deep level, we also have to look at the role of the written word that arose out of Europe, out of a Christian patriarchal culture, has been part of the closing down of ancient indigenous, feminine, spiritual wisdom. And I do want to say right away that from my point of view, demonizing white men today is extremely unjust. And I think it's tragic that there are now people who will tell little boys, little white boys, you are racist, you should own your racism. It's wrong. What I want to share with you today is that I'm seeing a deep cultural turning that I think if you see it and if you look for it more consciously, more sensitively, you will feel as I do that there is great hope today, great hope that humanity will make a turning towards life, towards supporting what we all need, which is fundamentally love and connection. Love and connection to one another and to all that lives. But we're not seeing that very clearly because the patriarchal system that grew out of Europe, building on Christianity, dominated the world increasingly, started in Europe. By the time of the Second World War, it was the US that became the center of the spread of this dominant worldview and system. And we need to be aware that that meant creating consumerism. It meant using knowledge from Freud, psychological knowledge, particularly through his nephew, Edward Bernays, using that to manipulate people to consume more than they would naturally do. And there was even an argument among economists, oh, it's not going to be possible. People are just going to keep buying and buying. And others say, oh, yes, we can make them do that. And there were even things like getting women to believe that smoking was a sign that they were empowered and important. So they marketed feminism and smoking together. So it's quite quite an evil system, I would say. But already by the time of the Second World War and the fossil fuel based consumer rat race that was imposed on us, it was more like a machine. The people who were involved in advertising, making women believe that their identity was connected to smoking, this was not coming from people who consciously tried to create ill health and a stupid, ridiculous symbol of power. Ridiculous. But those people who were trained into having that job was already so narrowly trained. And by the way, this is also how education and over specialization has been part of building up this system. Now, to come back to what I started talking about, which you'll see, I do this all the time. I'll go off to elaborate on some, I was going to say tangent, but it's not a tangent. Everything is connected. And it's made it very difficult for me, by the way, to express this in writing, because of course the written word wants a much more linear progression. And I'm all the time trying to point out, but this is connected, that's connected. Anyway, so to come back to why we should not be painting white men in particular as the enemy today, is that if we understand the foundations of this system, which were definitely, it was white men, they did burn women, and their values, let's remember they were misogynist, racist, and anti-nature. Now, this means this system was anti-life, and it's been anti-life from the outset. But we haven't seen how that system evolved and changed, and all the time was able to use propaganda from the top. So just like books were printed saying these women have to be burned, they're a threat to us all, and people went along with it. Just as that happened, by the time you move forward a few hundred years to after the Second World War, the majority goes along with this idea that smoking is how you're going to empower women. So that means, in a way, we've all been complicit in either going along with or supporting this system. So this is why also I feel we can have a very strong, very holistic, very deep rejection of the system, but to blame individual players now it's just wrong. It's wrong. It's unfair. And I think if we could understand that, we can also feel much more empowered and much more hopeful. And we can be compassionate, kind, loving towards people in power who are now continuing to impose a structure, a way of seeing the world that we are rejecting. There is a cultural turning. So if I could explain that from my looking at all of this, and now I am entering into territory which is not just Ladakh, but it's coming from in Ladakh, living in that culture. Of course, it had started changing a little bit, but I arrived in 1975, and at that point, in most of Ladakh, people were not aware of the system outside. They were still both self-reliant and self-respecting. And they were the happiest, most joyful, most vibrant, most vital people I had ever encountered. I just was enchanted. I had been living in Paris. I was a linguist. I'm mostly Swedish, but I have family in Germany and England, and I had ended up studying in many different countries. I'd ended up very interested in learning different worldviews. What had happened was that I went to university in Germany, and after the war, my family in Sweden, which both my parents were half Swedish and grew up there, and and in England and in all the cultures I had experienced, people were very prejudiced against the Germans after the war. And I ended up going there to study because I had family living there. And I ended up very impressed with both how the Germans were taking on the guilt of what had happened in Nazi Germany in the deepest way. No other country has done this. And there are a lot of countries that need to take responsibility for exterminating indigenous people, for the US bombing the Japanese as they did. There's lots of mea culpas that are needed. But so in Germany, I was impressed by that, but I was also impressed by a more holistic worldview. And I actually fell in love with Goethe and Hermann Hesse. And in fact, my bit of an introduction to Buddhism came through Germany. So that made me really interested in understanding different worldviews by learning different languages. So I had learned quite a lot of languages, and I had settled in Paris. And by this time I was 29. And then I was asked to go out to this unknown part of the world called Ladakh, or Little Tibet is often what it's been known as. And this part had been closed off. No one had been allowed to go there. And they wanted me to learn a bit of the language so that they could make a documentary about this unknown ancient culture. So I thought I was going for 6 weeks. And then I end up there, and almost overnight, I fall in love with these people. And by the time the filming is finished, which was 6 weeks, I'm so enchanted that I'm just giving up my job in Paris. I was working as a linguist. And now my excuse for staying is I'm going to do a thesis on the language. And I go through the whole region, which is quite big. It's about the size of Austria. And there are villages in this big region, and I'm having blissful hikes through the region and collecting folk stories, writing down the spoken language for the first time. And everywhere I go, I'm just falling in love and just in deep amazement at these people. And so very quickly, my linguistic work translates into doing everything I can to work with the local people, to try to help them understand the modern world that's coming in, which they don't. They have no knowledge about it. And so I end up as sort of ambassador from the West to explain, actually, we are not as wealthy as these tourists make it look. The tourists were coming in as it opened up. In the beginning, very few, but they were coming with the equivalent of coming in with $100,000 a day to spend. So if people had come flying from Mars to wherever you live, and every day had spent $100,000, you would also, as a young person, you'd be very influenced, and you say, wait a minute, I don't want to listen to my parents and farm or do whatever they want me to do. I'm going to become a Westerner. So I don't know how much time we'll have to go into all of that, but I will see in the questions how many of you are interested in hearing more about that, because I could talk for hours. There is just so much to tell. So just that interface between Westerners and the Ladakhis is a very important one. And if you're interested, please look at our materials, look at our film Paradise with Side Effects, our comic book, A Journey to New York, and a lot of other readings and so on that you could learn about that. But come back to the more central theme, which is the masculine and the feminine, and why the story of the cultural turning that I started talking about is fundamentally driven by women. And what I'm witnessing is, having had those lenses put on from Ladakh, that helped me when I had been out there for 2 years living with the people, and I come back to the West and I come back to my native country of Sweden. I'm suddenly seeing it with completely different lenses. And what happens is, I now understand why I would get depressed and why we have already in the 70s in Sweden, a country that's a paragon of success, modernity, empowering women, ecologically, democratically, held up by many people as the best. And here we already in the 70s have an epidemic of depression, alcoholism, and suicide. But we didn't have a system that allowed us to see that. So to this day, this lack of understanding of what's actually happening to people as part of this growth economy that started as a patriarchal exercise by global traders who managed to start controlling the development of humankind. From Europe, they started a journey that managed to spread across the whole world. And I so hope that you'll come away with a clear understanding that we're talking about a man-made system that became like a machine. So by the Second World War, when Freud's insights into psychology are used from the top by global trading corporations, global banks, global corporations, as a system, are now shaping our worldview to tell us who we are, to shape our view of humanity, our view of the world, our history. Now, when that is happening, please understand we're talking about a machine that, as I said, there were many women involved in advertising, women involved in the law, in engineering, all of it now trained to actually further that system. That system is not shaped by humanity. There were billions of people who did not help to shape it. There are still today billions of people who have not contributed to creating that system. And let's please distinguish between an artificial system and humanity. Let's distinguish between those little white boys who are born into this world that is a mixture of an artificial system, top down, and our innate urge, our deeper needs. Our bodies are incredible. This magic of everything that lives. It's unbelievable complexity. We have learned, not we, but this system learned quite a lot about the mechanics of our bodies. It learned quite a lot that has become impressive through science and technology, the magic of new hips and new knees and all kinds of amazing things. And in this today, the whole vaccine story is very important and has divided people terribly. I believe that if I could share with you what this learning was of understanding an indigenous, deeply embedded feminine culture and what was happening in the world outside, that you will also agree, let's not be divided over the vaccine. Let's not be divided. Let's realize that every child that's born innately is loving and wants and needs love. Let's not forget that. And let's never talk about human nature without remembering the children. Let's never fall into the trap of doing what has been done, which is that the dominant worldview is telling us who we are, and all the time now managing to confuse us and twist into a melange so that we're not looking at the system. We're not looking at it. Instead, that system has grown into a machine that on a daily basis uses algorithms, an army of soldiers to divide us. So please remember that we had Tristan Harris in The Social Dilemma. If you haven't seen that, please do look at at that film to hear from the pundits in Silicon Valley that we need to wake up to what the social media is doing. Now, you may already, I would have thought you're already worried about it, but I think you'll be more alarmed and more aware of the need for a political change, a structural change, not just whether you or I use the social media. It's not about that. It's about how we as a society need to be able to have a clarity, and that is the technologies of the future are a political choice. They are not somehow separate. The technology is not marching on by itself. It's being developed from the top down. You and I are not allowed to participate, and we need to. So I don't want to have us right away think that this is only a question of what we can do politically, but I do want to know that I want to encourage you to start coming together in smaller groups wherever you live. I would urge you to start by meeting with people who live in your vicinity to discuss feminine futures, ancient futures, local futures, feminine futures, and as a group, hopefully both men and women, discuss the bigger picture, to start separating yourself from this system. Don't confuse it with humanity. Don't fall into the trap of, technology develops on its own, it's evolutionary. That's all rubbish, that it's been pushed into us. So we become passively accepting of changes that we absolutely shouldn't, but we think we have no choice. So that we have algorithms today that are in the most evil possible way dividing us. We are polarized more than ever. I'm almost 80, and I've been so active in so many different countries. And, I learned to speak 7 languages, and I've been involved in other cultures, Korea, Japan, many others. And never, ever have I seen the madness of what we have today. And where does it come from? It doesn't come from human beings' hearts. It doesn't come from human beings' minds. It comes from a system where a narrow, narrow view has made people feed in and support an inhuman system, an anti-life system. I think right now I would like to pause and have you hopefully just think for a minute or less, and hopefully post questions and comments. I am always happy to have critical comments, and so if there are people who are disagreeing what I'm saying, and maybe people who say want me to get back onto the more specific, the feminine, please let me know. So let's take a little pause now for you to think and to post comments and questions, and then let's have some time for that. Thank you.
Okay, Helena. So we've got some questions and comments here. So the first one, which is in the chat box, was one from Gregory, and the question is, what's behind men's historical patterns towards arrogance? Is there a historical pattern towards arrogance? And what's behind
it? This is one of the problems, is that most of our history remains within this patriarchal system. So we have very little knowledge about what human beings were like before they were pulled into and oppressed by this system. Even today, we have cultures alive that have not been so pulled in, and we know almost nothing about them. And as we speak, their languages are being destroyed, they are being destroyed. And so one of the biggest issues for us today is that these nature-based, land-based cultures, many of them not necessarily described as indigenous, but they are still on the land. They have animals, they have plants, and they live off that, and they have a very different social order, and we know far too little about them. So historically, from what I'm talking about, what I actually witnessed in black and white in Ladakh, is that young men in a culture that is more nature-based, that is fundamentally community-based. So a key understanding is that the way we evolved for thousands and tens of thousands of years was that we evolved interdependent with one another in intergenerational community. Because when we lived off the land, we needed one another. And by the way, this is a big lesson for people who want to go and live in an eco-village, as I have always wanted to. The big lesson that I've learned also involved with the Global Eco-Village Network is that we really need to understand better both that deeper history and how this system not only changed us, but continues to pressure us intensely. So by the way, every price in the marketplace is a political choice, but we don't know that. We think that local natural things are naturally more expensive than something that uses lots of petroleum that's come from the other side of the world. And because we don't step back and collectively question that, do something about it, we often get trapped by the system. So what you can see when you really step back to try to understand what existed before the influence of this system, that, as I say, is what fills our history books with, from my point of view, a lot of false ideas. There, my experience again from Ladakh was that when people lived in this interdependent way, they needed each other, because you need a lot more than just one family that might go off and try to be self-reliant. I often like to say we were never self-reliant, we were community reliant. So now if you remember the community reliance, what that meant was every mother had about 10 caretakers for every child, and that included grandparents, great-grandparents, including the men, great uncles, 90 years old, were very important daily partners for the 1-year-old. And so you had this interdependence and interconnection. Now, what that meant, very clearly, I cannot tell you how moving and wonderful it was to experience how the 13-year-old boy would coo over a baby just like a grandmother would. How an 80-year-old male, in the same way, they were allowed to maintain their feminine. They weren't only allowed, they were expected as little boys to carry babies on their bodies. They carried babies on their backs. We've been trained to see that as exploitation. We've been trained to believe, oh, no, they should be in school. This is exploitation. This is human, an abuse. And that's again because we haven't had the books or the knowledge to really understand fully what it means to live in nature-based, community-based ways, and how that helps men and women to maintain their feminine. Many other things were connected to that. Singing together, chanting and singing is an actual tool, a technology that can help us experience a sense of oneness with other humans that is so profound. And it existed in virtually every spiritual tradition, even in every religion, which often became more patriarchal. But so I think when we look at history in a deeper way, we now have to go actively looking for material that we don't find in a conventional way. I hope that addresses a little bit.
That's good, Helen, because we've got quite a lot of comments and questions. So
Make it shorter. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to be a bit shorter because you've got a lot to say still. And want to share a comment here from Diego, who says the future is ancient, local, and feminine. And he feels that the opportunity of our time is that of integration, both the masculine and the feminine, and that the global south has a lot to offer to the global north here, which I think, to both men, women, and all gender. And he says, what are your thoughts on that? The global south will share he feels that the global south will share with the world, especially with the global north, the wisdom of communities from the global south, historically led by women. I think you're in resonance with that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is also part of our work, very much part of our work, is to try to create a deeper connection, deeper collaboration, precisely as you say, Diego, between the global south, usually the land-based global south that I referred to just now, where people, exactly as you say, still have much more of that pattern of existence, that existence of dependence, clear dependence on the land, on the water, on the trees around them, that more localized, land-based, community-based way of living. Now, people there in the global south are every day subjected to a system of propaganda that is a mental pollution. It's an onslaught. It's colonialism in a new form, through media, through advertising, and through tourism that invades especially the more healthy regions that haven't been so spoiled by this consumer machine, get invaded by tourism. And all the time, the tourism, the media, the advertising tell those people, you are backward, you are primitive, you have nothing to teach us. And this is, as you say, Diego, one of the most important things today is for us to wake up to the fact, I think I mentioned it earlier, that there are billions of people that are still living differently, but the machine that is set in the name of schooling, of development, and massive investment in infrastructure. Our governments are paying for infrastructure that is helping to push those people off the land, break down the community into cities where they are suddenly fighting for scarce jobs. They are suddenly pitted against each other, and this often leads to violent conflict. They are also so impoverished in the city that it leads to mass immigration. The immigration, even into a country like Sweden, where I grew up without really any sense of racism. Now racism is growing, a swing to the right that's very scary. So the system is something we really need to understand to avoid these conflicts. And as you say, Diego, much more deep dialogue. And for many people, that can sound contradictory. If on a shallow level you hear localization, and then you think, well, we should just be isolated into our own little local. No, that's counterproductive. We have so much to learn from the Global South. The Global South has so much to learn from us, and that is that this system doesn't work for us, and we're showing it. There are so many white Western people who are leaving that consumer culture, going back to the land, rebuilding community, desperately trying to live in a different way. And they need to learn from you in the Global South. So there is the true narrative of what's happening is the opposite of what the dominant system is telling us.
Okay, Helena, there's a little bit more along these lines. I mean, we've got here a comment from Jacqueline who's saying that this is well expressed and that it ties in very much with she's working doing feminine masculine balance, which sounds very appropriate. And we got Tia here, who's I might not pronounce your name right. I'm sure I don't. I'm very sorry. who said, you spoke about patriarchal dominance began with the impact of Christianity. Tia questions this and sees Roman imperialism and empire building seem deeply entrenched in a patriarchal system, and the invention of this Roman Christianity seems to be the next phase in a more mental domination as it attacked indigenous earth and place-based people. I don't know, I don't quite understand. I don't know if you do, Helena?
No, I mean, I think with Romans, you're still talking about Christianity, aren't you? So,
yes. Yeah.
I think in a broader way, I also want to say that I stand for cultures, peaceful cultures. I want to be a voice for a multitude of peaceful cultures. And as part of that, I reject civilization. Now, most of what we have looked at that we understand as civilization has been expansionist, including the Romans, but even including Genghis Khan, including some of the Islamic invasions into India and other countries. So once we get a greater clarity about the difference between cultures that lived peacefully off their land, we also will start looking at things like Maria Gimbutas, a very important voice, a woman archaeologist, who was telling us that there was evidence of peaceful, matriarchal, goddess-based cultures in Europe. She was laughed at by the dominant system. Now DNA studies have proven her right. This is part of why I have hope that we will have a wake up and we will have a bigger picture continuum where we all become clear that for all of us, supporting peaceful, nature-based cultures is what's going to give all of us a sense of that deep connection, that sense of the life that is infinitely complex. Once we start living in a more connected way, we realize that we've been trained to think that fireworks on 4th of July is more interesting than the stars. Once we wake up to the stars instead of fireworks, that's a very clear symbol of the cultural shift that I see happening. I see more and more people tuning into the waxing and the waning of the moon. I think, a natural hunger for reconnecting to life, reconnecting what gives us meaning, what gives us joy. And wonderfully, all of these trends also make us healthier, literally physically healthier and stronger. So at a deep level, real strength lies in connecting with life. That's what heals us, that's what nurtures us. That we have to start distinguishing, because there are also plastic ideas that undermine us all the time. So the political and what I was talking about in terms of the pollution on minds in the global south, that's happening to us on a daily basis. And I noticed someone had asked about this social dilemma, was the film about how social media is a toxic, I would say, a truly evil system. Remember, algorithms know that if there's violent, hateful disagreement, it extracts more wealth to the top. So the trillionaires coming out of the high-tech and financial casino are born of technological tools that are driving the creation of this completely artificial wealth. It's not real wealth, but as long as we go along with it, they have this power over us. And waking up to this is now vital, because AI as an army, and if we're talking about a system as an army, is going to support what the algorithms have already shown us. On a daily basis, second to second basis, algorithms are sniffing around the world how to extract wealth, for distant investors who have never seen the people that the system is abusing, who have never seen the trees they're cutting down, never seen the water they're polluting. It's a blindness that allows your son, maybe your uncle, your relative. I know people who are in the investment field who are making lots of money. They're not evil people, but they're, as it were, benefiting from a very evil system where they're destroying so much that they don't even see it, doesn't even register. So we, those of us interested in the feminine, those of us interested in regaining the real power and health and joy that comes from life, we have to become a little more economically literate. Now, I also want to be sure to be reminded, I'm reminding myself now, not only to talk to you about what we can do to change the system, I also want to talk a bit about what we can do as individuals right now. Because many of
That brings me
so many
to
of
the
you
next
think,
question.
yeah,
Can
okay.
I? Yeah, because we got quite a lot. It's lovely to see so much engagement and so many
Okay.
comments here. And so one of them, speaking to what you were just saying, is that what can we do as individuals? There's several here, but there's one that talks about how effective, this is a question from Jan, how effective are the small groups getting together? How effective that is making the big change that we need? And it's just hard to know if it's hard to know how to affect big change. Indeed, it is. That's
Yeah.
one
Well,
question, and yeah.
well, I mean, the affecting the big change. I believe that if you who are listening would right now turn to even just one or two other people, and ideally near where you live, if you would do that, you would be developing a strategy that I believe would be the most effective for ultimately affecting bigger change. But the beauty of having had these deep lessons from Ladakh is the recognition that we need one another, that the isolation, the emphasis on the I, the emphasis on the individual, and the guilt that people are now being made to carry, the blame, the self-blame, the sense of inadequacy, the system has managed, first of all, to deprive us all of the love that we deserve as children. Nothing to do with your mother or my mother, who was already shaped by this individualistic system. So it was basically, yeah, she had some help, but and my parents had more time. But the time pressures that are exerted on us now, it just breaks my heart, because mothers are made to feel that it's their fault. Mothers who don't strangle their children today deserve triple gold medals, because they've been put into a completely unnatural situation where they're told the work of mothering is not important, it's not seen, it's invisible. If you want to be someone, you've got to be an important someone who serves this system. And by nurturing and loving your child, you don't do that. So therefore, it doesn't even count. So the mothers are made to feel that that's nothing. They're made to do it in isolation, which is completely unnatural. The children are so social. They get bored with their mothers. They need to have much more contact. So this is also a fundamental bit of understanding, so that as an individual, there's so much that you could do already now in this system. There are so many, thank goodness, women who are turning to mothers groups, at least, so at least they have support from other mothers in a similar situation. But they need to be able to articulate much more. They need to be able to be much clearer about their need for those connections. Instead, they're made to feel like they're being a bit selfish, or they're too weak, they should be managing on their own. And so yeah, there is, maybe some of you will have heard of the book, The Continuum Concept. It was written by a friend of mine. It became a bestseller. It was with Penguin, but I always felt that she didn't live long enough with the people. She didn't live with them at all. She didn't speak the language. So she overemphasizes the mother's role and therefore often created more guilt. I'm trying to say to every mother right now, please understand that you're put in a situation which I hate to put it this harshly, but I often now think of it as turning into what should be the most beautiful thing a woman can do. To have children, to rear them, to love them, to be loved by them, has been turned into a torture chamber because she's bombarded with ideas that do not support her and that do not truly, at a deep level, help her to get all the help she deserves. So, yeah, anyway, I'm going on for too long, but these are very important points that I hope you all hear. So this is why, if you, as a mother or as an older person, whoever you are, realize that we need one another, we need to support each other, and you start creating a little group, even as I say, of 2 or 3 people who can meet on a regular basis, try to combine it with doing something you enjoy. It might be hiking, it might be cooking, it might be singing. One of the things I touched on as a magic, meditative, spiritual connection building, and you might need to be a bit more than 2 to do that. But if you come together, do something you enjoy, and devote some time to the bigger picture, in the bigger picture we provide in Local Futures, you can also find writings. I mean, we have a website that is like, you know, a PhD on local futures, feminine futures, ancient futures, so that you then together can share that. Remember, one of perhaps the most evil things that's happened is that this machine has robbed you of time, all of us. Why? Time? What has happened? What has made every minute count for dollars? It's a completely artificial system. And we have blindly accepted the technology as evolutionary. No, they came from the top and they served the extraction, just like the algorithms have, and now AI will do even more. They market it to us like, oh, it's going to help for your health, it's going to be helpful for you. No, it is helping to extract further wealth, and it's one of the most important issues we now need to discuss in a group. But once we create a small group, we're actually gaining something deep and fundamental, which is connection and care. And why it's so important that you try to be near each other is that you can actually lend a helping hand. Maybe I can take the baby for some hours now while you have time for yourself. Maybe you need a massage. Maybe you need to just go out and have time to yourself. I can help an old person who needs to go to the shop or whatever. So we can start to build that sense of interdependence, non-commercial, love-based, community-based. And while we look at that bigger picture, when we change the I to a we have already empowered ourselves. And then let's not be afraid to look at how we then could move on to bigger change. So I'll come back to that if we want to talk about the bigger system change, our theory of change. But maybe another question first.
Yes, and this relates to very much to the bigger picture and the side of resisting and perhaps also renewal. This is from Sherry, and she's saying, how do we start fresh with a new system change without, in this specific case, civil war in America or a new globally expanded war, which I think is something we are all worried about these days. And she says she's gearing up to step into a leading public speaker and organizing role and looking into established grassroots groups. Are there any that you would recommend? But this is a double question. You know, how do we make system change without ending up in in civil war, in this case in America. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Of course. Yeah, no, I mean, the system change that we're recommending would have exactly the opposite effect of leading to civil war, exactly the opposite. Because as we understand better what's happening, we cannot but have compassion for the other side. So this is exactly the opposite. The anger, the divisiveness is a function of this system. It's not coming out of human hearts or human minds. It's us manipulated by technology and finance. Remember, the scarcity of time in itself creates blindness. The superficiality, it literally leads to, as we speed past one another, everything becomes dependent. What do you look like? Do you drive a fancy car? Do you have a PhD? What the Ladakis knew is that they said tiger stripes are on the outside, human stripes are on the inside. In other words, what characterizes us, who we are, is on the inside. You only get to know that when you actually know people. Then you can see, are they kind? Do they have a sense of humor? Do they have wisdom? Do they have skills? So the speed machine, which is now, should be one of the main reasons why you say no to AI. Don't be duped by how it's going to help you write letters, or by all means use it. We are using it now. Even we almost can't avoid using it. So I'm not talking about your individual use. But if you use it, which in some way or other we all do, let's use it to share the wisdom that politically we need democratic process to start slowing this down. And that means unleashing AI into a corporate empire where corporations have been dominating our governments. So I suppose I need to address this other part of the system, which is that from Maria Gimbutas to the place-based, goddess-based cultures into this patriarchal system, which on the way there were other civilizations that expanded, brutally expanded, but the one that became global was the European one that expanded across the world. And that then turned into a monster fueled, it was monstrous all along. It was slavery, it was enclosures. So the enclosures, say in England, drove people away from the land, away from community, into a mess in London. Everything broken down, rich, poor, the poor who would steal a bit of bread, dried old bread, would be sent off as prisoners to Australia to rape and pillage the land and destroy indigenous people there. So this system was brutal of people and nature. And then with fossil fuels after the Second World War, those were used to tell us, oh, we've got this new way of growing food. And toxic chemicals that have been used as weapons were now weaponized on the land. And we're now all sort of learning about that industrial agriculture having been toxic, poisoning water, poisoning soil, and poisoning us. The main reason for cancer, for neurological illness, comes back to that agriculture. It's pesticides, it's spraying, later on genetic engineering. So it's all part of the system. And let's please not get caught up in individuals in that system. Let's please keep that bigger picture. And so if we do that, we are not going to be engaging in civil war. We're not going to be full of hate for people who have been trapped into being stuck on one side of that equation. We're going to be sharing the knowledge, and we're already, the path that we recommend is already happening. It's happening from the bottom up, and wherever you see it, it's demonstrating win, win, win. And that's where local food systems are the most inspiring and the most obvious ways of healing social relationships and the relationship with the land. So I won't belabor that because there's so much to say about that, but please pay attention to that movement of building up local food economies. farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, permaculture. Beware that regenerative agriculture has been marketed by corporations to undermine the local food movement. Regenerative agriculture focuses just on the soil. It's been marketed as a rejection of industrial agriculture, but it doesn't reject monoculture. Monoculture for export has been a fundamental structure that destroys healthy economies, and that means healthy relationships to the land and social relationship. So remember that monoculture for export is what traders imposed going back to the beginning of this global economy. And regenerative agriculture doesn't question that. It doesn't talk about the need for shorter distances, which inevitably encourages more diversity on the land. So shorter distances linked to diversity is a win-win-win. You reduce plastic, you reduce energy use, and you rebuild community. And it's the community between the producers and the consumers that is already healing left and right divisions. Very often conservative farmers who had been led to believe that the chemicals were necessary, that this was the only way to farm, are now filled with joy when in the farmers' markets, most of the consumers are people who have green and actually left-leaning values. And so they actually don't mind a speckle on the apple or on the banana. And they actually prefer to see that there are some marks there that show that it's not been sprayed to smithereens, and it's not a variety that has been bred to look good and transport well. They actually also communicate that they don't care if one banana is half the size of the other banana. Now, what we don't know as consumers generally, even as environmentalists, is the fundamental importance of agriculture. The agricultural system and the entire global food economy is the biggest contributor to our ill health, as I said, cancer, neurological illness, obesity, heart disease, because of the trans fats, the high fructose corn syrup being pushed on our children. And talk about a pandemic, an epidemic that government could easily do something about. Nothing has been done. Now, this plus what we don't know is that the transport of food back and forth across the world, which is happening on a larger and larger scale, that transport back and forth is the biggest contributor to fossil fuel use and emissions. And now the Green New Deal that's being brought in is not at all talking about reducing energy. It's being talked about in terms of CO2 emissions. And CO2 is the carbon trading is a way to make global corporations richer while everybody else gets poorer. They have been allowed to frame the climate agenda so that they continue to transport things back and forth, and there is no mention of the emissions or energy use from that. Instead, we're now told through a Green New Deal there should be more and more renewable, including nuclear. And they turned this carbon trade into a way of making money in a criminal way, criminal. Now, this abuse is still not being exposed. Instead, what's happening is many people now believe that climate change isn't happening at all, it's just made up. Please don't fall into that trap. Please be aware that it's almost impossible that you could have a system that uses so many fossil fuels, all these pesticides, turning the soil into dust, cutting down trees, which is the clear cutting of the Amazon, mainly to grow soya beans for animals on the other side of the world. That global food system is the biggest contributor and is being driven by global corporations, and those global corporations are ordering our governments that they mustn't do anything that reduces their profit. If governments dare to do that, they will be sued in kangaroo courts where we don't hear anything about it. Lawyers in the morning representing Monsanto, in the afternoon representing Sweden, supposedly. And these clauses are in trade treaties. So trade treaties are one of the most important things we need to look at if we're interested in system change. Now, I really hope that those of you who want to hear more about some of the personal changes that you can do without changing the system, I want to be sure we have time for that. But since many of you are asking about system change, I do need to alert you to the fact that one of the best ways to understand today's system and why governments worldwide are working against us is because they have become totally blindly supportive of creating a corporate empire that is wealthier and wealthier, and they themselves as governments are getting poorer vis-a-vis this corporate empire. So please come away from this talk to remember that this system I go on about is a corporate interlinked empire where banks and corporations are running our world, whether Sweden or Costa Rica or the United States. Governments are taken to court. If they want to improve and protect the environment, if they want to raise minimum labor rates, they're forbidden. They have signed in black and white. We won't do anything that reduces your profit. Please also understand that at the same time as they remove any rules, any regulations that would inhibit global corporations' activities, they are over-regulating at the local, regional, and national level. So we have more and more bureaucracy pushed by big business that lobby government with billions of dollars to destroy their competitors. So Monsanto actually got the US to regulate genetic engineering early on to destroy any smaller competitors. Big hotel chains got government to bring in regulations. So if you want to rent out your room, you've got to have fire mattresses, fire doors, you have to spend many thousands of dollars. So the over-regulation at the local and national level is leading to people thinking that the government is the problem. And so when we see a swing to the right, all around the world now, also in Sweden, it's because people are only seeing what governments are doing, and they want government out of the way. They're over-regulating them, they're lying, or they think they're making up climate. So what I'm saying here is really important. The bigger picture is so important for us to avoid the blindness that leads to a rejection of government. And that means allowing the corporate empire to have more possible effect. And this is where, coming to Trump, that Trump is actually allowing the corporate for-profit empire to have more power. It looks like it's different. People often ask us, they say, tariffs, isn't that what you're also talking about? No, we're talking about more or less the opposite of what Trump is saying. They're corporate, viewing the world through the lens of what is good for business is good for us. No, what is good for our health, our emotional health, our hearts, our bodies is the opposite. And that's where, if we start taking the steps at the local level to build more connected, interdependent communities, we are doing what we need, and we're also creating models that show people this goes beyond left and right. We've got to leave the party politics as they've been served up to us, because actually left and right in Scandinavia, in every government, socialist governments, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, the left has been subsidizing and deregulating global cooperation and creating an empire that works against us, coming straight line from the patriarchal fossil fuels, more and more energy for corporations. Now in England, middle-class people are told they have to choose between heating and eating. And in the meanwhile, they are now wanting to develop an AI infrastructure using water, energy, and completely neglecting the local infrastructure. So everywhere you go in the world now, we have to worry about the bridges and the roads and the airports and even the management of the airports, because that's being neglected. And we need to wake up very quickly.
So this ties in with a very pertinent question from Maya, who talks about whether, or asks whether you're familiar with the concept of leverage points, which is like system analysis. Basically, where can we act most effectively to stop this destructive growth? And how do we move from the theory to collective action? And one of the things that we at Local Futures talk a lot about, which you spoke on, was the resisting the free trade treaties and subsidies. But what do you think here? What do you consider to be the sort of acupuncture pressure points that we can hit?
Absolutely, by far, the most important action is what I call big picture activism. It's understanding this bigger picture and sharing it, actively sharing it. To understand it, I think, some people, of course, are already there, but they skip over the importance of sharing that. So very often people who understand the need to rebuild the deeper community and the local and the connected, they want to create a model of that. But they don't think very much about how are they going to share that model, how are they going to get more people to see it and to deeply understand it. And, very often it's experiential knowledge that would allow us to do that. So we need more films, we need more podcasts, we need more discussions. Wherever you live, you could maybe start in your network. Urge people to look at the materials, to watch the films, and to join the movement. So we have now an international network. So we work with people all around the world, and we have examples of what they're doing. And I think it's very empowering when you realize that you're part of something that is global. So please also look at our World Localization Day, where people around the world are celebrating this turn towards community, towards the feminine, towards the connected. So remember again, archetypically, to come back to the feminine is about seeing, sensing, experiencing, feeling, being sensitive to the connections between people. What do we mean by connections? We mean noticing that if someone is looking a little bit under the weather, being sensitive to this, being caring, but even just seeing it, even perceiving it is something that we're sort of losing. And remember, it's partly because we're running so fast. So the paradox also in our personal lives is that I urge people to cultivate what I've sometimes called creative schizophrenia. And what I mean by that is that we need to go in two opposite directions simultaneously, because once we see the urgency of what's going on in the bigger system, then we feel a sense of, oh my God, what can I do? And I would by no means say, well, we need to slow down in terms of dealing with the system. But if we don't slow down, and if we don't nurture our souls and our deeper sense of who we are, we're really not, we're just going to wither away. So it's a strange thing that I would urge everyone to be sure, ideally on a daily basis, to slow down, ideally have time in nature, ideally have time in some kind of community effort, which, people can't necessarily do every day. But if they're part of a community, they can look forward to that being in 2 weeks, or even maybe on a weekly basis, to come together to sing or dance or meditate or hike or garden together, repair each other's old furniture, or maybe sew together to make clothes out of used clothes. There are literally millions, actually probably there are billions of people that engage in many of these nature-based, community-based practices, because in the global south, as we mentioned earlier, there are people who still live much more in that way, but also so inspiring in the Western world. And that includes coming out of Beijing, coming out of Mumbai, coming out of the big new monster cities in the so-called global south. People realize very often, quite quickly, that high-rise, speedy, competitive, glamorous consumer culture is empty. And when they are successful, they prove it. They usually buy a property in nature or closer to nature. They choose to spend their time in nature. They often now start farming. So we have all this evidence of what human beings need and want, which is coming back to that understanding of how we evolved, who we are. We need one another. So if you can both cultivate ways of regaining a greater sense of strength, joy, and health through reconnection to others and to nature, but also devote some of your time, however much you can say. My ideal would be 50-50. In my life, I'm probably more like 80-20, that I every day have walk in nature, every day I quiet my mind. And I find also that reminding myself of what to be grateful for is a very helpful practice. And it can even be things like, I recently hurt my hip, and it was such a tragedy for me, because I love walking in nature as my favorite pastime ever. And my most joyful memories of that were in Ladakh, hiking in those mountains. And my husband is now quite ill with a chronic illness, but our memories together of hiking in the Himalayas are like the peak experiences of all my life. And then I suddenly did my hip, and it was so scary. And I managed through natural ways to improve it. And like every day, this is now 6 months, and my hip still hurts, but every day, a wave of gratitude about that I can still walk in nature makes me happier. And so the gratitude, the slowing down and being more conscious of what is good. And for me also, I have to say that every day in my email inbox, I get examples of these new localization, community-based initiatives, or people saying to me that we inspired them and that it's changed things for them. So that actually is an incredibly nurturing thing for me. So, yeah.
Okay, Helena. So just to here look a bit at the time, we've got half an hour left. But I guess you also want to have a bit of time to talk about the global to local, and maybe more about the renewing on a local level, just to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
There are a whole host of questions here and comments, and one of them, for example, is about someone from Southeast Asia who also comes from an indigenous culture and can resonate with what you say, but it's not the experience this person's had. and that this generalization, where do we strike a balance, and how do we qualify what we are saying to preserve the wholeness, and what you were saying before about your lessons from Ladakh at the beginning, no? So that's one thing. There's
No,
also
I don't understand the question.
The question that Di here says that she loves what you're saying, but that she questions some of your generalizations about indigenous cultures. At least that's not been her experience. I'm guessing maybe this is more referring to maybe the rosy picture you painted at the beginning of the culture you knew in Ladakh when you came there the first time. And well, that's not the experience she's had, no? And do you want to say something to that?
Yeah, well, I do, absolutely. It's really tragic that people often think that what they're seeing is indigenous culture, but very often they're talking about cultures that were, not only brutalized hundreds of years ago, but on a daily basis are still being undermined. So I can totally understand that it sounds exaggerated, and I guess I hope that if you're still with us, that you would agree with this need for deeper connections between people and nature, that you would embrace the idea that rebuilding more local, strong communities connected to each other and to nature, that's a vision that can resonate with you. Because that, as it happens, that is the foundation of what indigenous cultures were privileged to practice before, hundreds of years ago. The system all around the world started destroying that. So that would be one way. And I also now just happen to see someone saying about regenerative agriculture. I don't know if they're still there or not.
Yes, yes.
I wanted to say, yeah, absolutely. I love the term regenerative. It's a very good term. And I just really pray that you hear me, that when people who were farming organically, highly diversified, doing wonderful things to heal the soil and to produce healthy food, they often called themselves permaculture, organic, biodynamic. Now they're starting to call themselves regenerative. And I find that unfortunate, because Kellogg's and giant corporations, Nestle, are calling themselves regenerative. And they've managed to get people to focus, I believe, too narrowly just on the soil and not enough on the need for shorter distances, because they're also putting out the message that small farms can't feed the world. So it's part of a whole picture. And I know that there are wonderful people, and at the grassroots, the vast majority who are calling themselves regenerative are doing really fabulous things. But it's a little bit, what I'm warning against is that Monsanto tried to persuade people that when they hybridize seeds, if they use hybrid seeds, and what Mendel did was the same as what they're doing. So they were saying genetic engineering is genetic engineering, and luckily people generally did question that. So I'm saying that today, when it comes to not being weakened by the system from above, we need to pay attention to the language. In the real world, I am an advocate of linguistic diversity, of the more diversity, the better. But you see, we're now talking about a movement that's trying to change the industrial global system. Unfortunately, in regenerative, they don't talk about global and they don't talk about local classically. So that's all I'm saying. Please bring that in. Please bring that in.
And we have another question here or a comment from someone here without name about masculinity. A lot of men or masculinity not knowing what to do with it itself in the political sphere in the US and in many other places. So how can we help men? How can they play to their strength, use their strength, their energies, without having to repress their masculinity?
Well, see, again, archetypically, and I wish, there's just so much. Archetypically, the man is the strong man, and the man also archetypically more focused going out. And, sort of classically, the woman at the hearth, the man going out and doing the hunting. And in the modern era, it looked for a while like the woman at home with the children and the man out there earning living was sort of the right model. And that ignored the fact, as I tried to show, that in the traditional setup, when we lived closer to the land and in more localized economy, it was more complex than that. And women weren't just doing the children. They were also important voices in political and economic decision making. And they still, in many parts of the global south, you can see that they play a different role. And they do have more care for the children. Now, so what we call masculinity has become often this exaggerated toxic masculinity. And I often think of it as a teenage boy culture, that more speed, the more, the computer game, the more of the technocracy, someone was mentioning that, the more pushed by the sort of teenage boy. And around the world, you can see that they tend to get caught up in that more rapidly. I guess one of the projects that exemplifies what I'm talking about was a friend of mine who was a counselor, and he was counseling men who had been told they could either go to prison or jail or have this counseling because they had been abusing women. They had been violent or abusive of women, usually their partners. Now, what the counseling consisted of was for those men to be able to open up and to feel their emotions, to be able to cry, to be able to deeply express who they were. And that was through community, that was in group. And this is also what AA has been founded on. And why I feel the healing that comes from that shared journey of healing, which means being able to be vulnerable. Being vulnerable, that feels like the opposite of masculine. The strong is a shield. You don't cry, you don't have feelings, you in no way are weak because the emotional has been painted as weak. There's so much more to say about it because in many cultures that are called macho, like in Spain, where I lived for a long time, men could actually cry, they could sing, they could carry babies, even in modern Spain in the 80s. And yet in the more developed corporatized cultures, including Scandinavia, America, the Anglo world, no, that was very feminine. So men, to regain their deeper strength as men, need to be able to be vulnerable. And so the real strength we're talking about is one that is able to deal with emotion, that is able to be truly supportive for both their women and children, because they're able to be human. They're not a caricature of some strong guy with muscles and who's good at technology, but who doesn't have any feelings. So reclaiming the masculinity is really reclaiming our full humanity.
There's so many here, but here's one that maybe ties in with some of the things that does tie in with some of the things we talked about before, which is how do we propose working with people on the opposite end of the political spectrum? because you were talking about you were both talking about the right wing, the left wing, and getting away from the political theater. And in this divisive time that we are living, we are more and more. It's getting more and more difficult to work together, unless perhaps it's on a very local level. But so,
Yeah.
do you?
Well, I love that whoever you said that or they did, except at the very local level. I love a project started by a friend of mine in England, in Frome, that's called Flat Pack Democracy. And basically, they realized that they wanted to take the party politics out of the local government, the local council. And so they started a party which was basically locals for Frome, for our community. And the speculation in the community was, oh my, how is it ever going to be possible for Peter, who's conservative, actually Peter was not conservative, Peter who was left-leaning and Bob who were right-leaning, how could they ever sit down together? And the amazing thing is, as they literally change their perspective to be focused on these trees, on that mountain, on this road here, on these people, what's needed in our local community, it turned out that they were so much more in agreement than they were when they were linked to party politics that have now ended up polarizing and destructive while supporting a corporate for-profit empire that is set on extracting wealth through divisiveness. That's what's happened structurally. So as people actually come back to real life and to actually, as I say, addressing real issues in their community, you would be amazed how much more agreement there is. So this is why we need to understand localization as a solution multiplier, and why we need to start that process while also the main thing for the dominant system is that we expose that left and right and green leaders are not discussing the real issues. They are going ahead and handing over more power to the global corporation. And that means also saying, yeah, we won't have anything to do with controlling technology. We won't have anything to do with actually preventing a techno system from strengthening the global corporate power. No, we need to be sending a very clear mandate, and we need now to have our national governments there to start working with the voters to transform the system. It can be done peacefully. There is a global to local path that could happen peacefully. It's not one that says that from today till tomorrow, Monsanto is going to be shut down, or USAID, from one day to the next. No, it's one that gives a period of transition, makes that possible, but with clarity that we actually do need to change USAID. I can tell you so much of that money is going in a very destructive direction because it's blind, it's part of this big system. So the way forward is the mandate of now representatives from the social and environmental movements having recognized that both human beings and nature are being actively destroyed by this system. And so it's, for me, the first step forward is for us to try to educate ourselves laterally. It's not about tomorrow trying to write to our congressman or our member of parliament. It's reaching out across the divide of those who care more about one issue and those who care more about another, to say, actually, whether you're concerned about illness, war, climate, whatever you're concerned about, look at how this big system is not supporting you and is actually contributing to your problem. So we need genuine systems change. Please don't let people talk about systems change and conflate ecosystems and social cultures with this techno-economic global system that has grown up through this patriarchy. Please keep an eye on that system that would unite all of us, because men, women, indigenous or not indigenous. I saw someone commented there are lots of dysfunctional indigenous cultures that had not been interfered with. I don't know how we would know that, because but it may well be true. So the point isn't that every indigenous culture was perfect. In terms of what I'm saying is the indigenous culture I experienced, and then step by step witnessing the changes that happened because of the global economy, gave me the clarity to then see the same pressures in Sweden, in America, in Spain. And I do think that most of us will agree that we need community and we need a healthier relationship with nature. Now, exactly what language we use and whether we want to reference indigenous cultures, that's not the most important thing going forward. But local is very important. And that's why I'm saying to the regenerative movement, please add that dimension. Yeah.
Can I say there's
yeah.
a question here from Lisa that ties in very well with that, picking up on the local. And she's saying, asking you whether you see localization inherently as serving a more feminine culture. And if so, why? And the reason why she asks is because, as she says, patriarchy seems to survive locally as well as globally. So she wonders if the nature-based is the key.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Absolutely. I mean, so our localization is, see, we've got to understand that we are nature-based. Whatever we do, there is nothing in any molecule in AI or algorithms that doesn't come from nature. So we are nature-based. However, we need to choose between a nature-based way of living where we don't see that we're part of nature and we don't see what we do to nature, versus a nature-based path where those of us who are involved in getting our food, drinking our water, using wood, whatever, we have some idea of the impact we're having on that water and on that soil. So that this is the tragedy, and that's why it's easy to be very compassionate with people who don't see the connections. Because, so for me, it's about blindness more than anything. Blindness among most of us and blindness at the top. And what we're talking about is a localization where we do become aware and are able to respond to the infinite complexity, the diversity, and the constant change in the living world. And that's in people and in nature. So we don't create a label and say, okay, all Muslims are like this, and a picture, or a label, this is whatever it might be in the living world. No, we're open to this reality of this individual person. And one day they might have done this, another day that, and the trees on the mountains. In a local economy, we could never clear cut all those trees and call that progress. But that's what we're caught up in this economic system. So there's a certain basic economic literacy that means understanding the global economy and this blindness, and an understanding that, of course, we need to have a better understanding of the impact that we're having on nature and ultimately on ourselves. And so that's all this is about shortening the distances so we can see what we do, and then we can have genuine collective understanding about what is real and what isn't real. Now we hear a discussion about people caught up in this idea of what's real and what isn't real. They're all the time remaining in a system where we can't possibly have any real knowledge because we're so distant. We don't know. We may think that, George Clooney is this or that or whatever, but I grew very early on from the Ladakh experience and so on, always very skeptical about claiming to know for certain what somebody is like, what is their motivation, who they really are, when I've never even met them, I've never even been in their proximity. So we start learning to respect experiential knowledge more, and inevitably we end up also developing more respect for ourselves and for others.
There's a comment here, it's not actually a question, but about the role of the fossil fuels, the fossil power culture that is as old masculine powers of the past, but also that pushing us over the edge. Yeah. And I wondered if we haven't really spoken about the climate crisis, and we'll get to that also in our next episode. But maybe you want to say a little bit about that?
Sorry,
Or do you
again,
want
I missed the question. Which one
No,
is it?
there wasn't really a question. It is a, there's a comment here about the fossil power culture uh, as pushing us over the planetary edge. Uh, and that it's I mean, we haven't really spoken about that today at all. Do you want to say anything about that?
The fossil power culture, fossil fueled culture,
Yeah, the
pushing us.
fossil fuels driving us over the edge of destruction here.
I worry about only focusing on fossil fuels because, as you'll hear from my colleague Camilla, who will be on the next one, she will explain to you that it's the corporate system that has been allowed to frame climate and to frame the entire worldview. And they've been framing it in everywhere, psychology and medicine and climate. So what's being developed is nuclear power, is renewable energy in an extremely destructive way. Giant farms, putting up windmill farms where there is no wind. You wouldn't believe what's going on because the narrow profit margins for giant global corporations are all that's counting. And left and right governments are going along with this. And unfortunately, the environmental movement hasn't been looking globally enough. And that's why I hope you'll please embrace what we're trying to say, which is we need much more global understanding. And I probably didn't say that clearly enough. And that's through deeper dialogue from the bottom up. It's hard to find it in the media. You have to look actively for the organizations, the networks that are basing what they have to say on experiential knowledge on the ground. And that will give you more accurate information, and it will give you also more hope, more faith in humanity. And I'm seeing there are a few people who are, both, I'm probably skeptical about indigenous culture, what they can teach us. And I just saw someone talking about my friend Joanna Macy, who's done wonderful work to get us to connect at a deeper level. I completely recommend her work, which you would also find if you look at our material. And Joanna has been a close friend since, it's now I think it's, almost, I met her in 77. So she's been a close friend since then. And I hope that you look at our materials. We've got so much to offer. And I realize this has been quite chaotic and all over the place, but I hope it gave you a taste of what ancient futures, local futures, and feminine futures will look like.
And there's one question, well, there's so many questions left, but the one about what can we do locally? And I just want to invite people to look at one of the resources we have called the Localization Action Guide, where there are lots of good ideas and examples of how we can engage locally and how we can either join something that's already existing or start something ourselves with other people. So that's a really useful resource. And maybe there's something you want to say here too, Helena, to what can we do locally?
Well, I just again want to say that the whole picture I'm trying to paint is so big and so global, and that I just hope the basic premise throughout all of this is that we lived in a more connected way, connected in intergenerational community and deeply connected to place, respecting. Remember, the climates were different. Some people live in the mountains, they live by the sea, and they were deeply connected to their place on the earth. And that's how we had cultural diversity. That's how it arose. Now, if we believe that our future means healing the earth and that we are of the earth, and we want to come back to that, then I hope you'll really look at our materials, because that's what this is about. It's the reconnection between people and nature. We are being duped into believing that we don't need nature. So part of the AI story that's being told is that AI will now get their resources from Mars and from going to fight over minerals on Mars, and that we're not going to need the Earth, so we can clean it up again and we'll all be happy here because we won't have to work. That's a narrative we're being told, and I would urge you to please listen deeply in your heart and see when do you feel happy? When do you feel better? Do you have that connection with nature? Can you tell how much happier you feel when you are connected to others and nature? And then please allow that to help guide you. So that's what I hope from this webinar. Thank you.
Well, thank you all of you for joining us and for staying, for all of those of you that stayed to the end. It was a long session, and we'll look more closely at your questions and comments afterwards. Maybe we might address that some of those things in afterwards when we send you the recording. And someone also asked if we'll share the chat, because there's so many good resources here that people have shared and comments and so forth, and we will do that. And we also invite you to join our next webinar, which is on February 19th with Camila Moreno, where we will talk about climate, carbon, and technocracy. And she's a real powerhouse and has spent years and years behind the scenes at every single climate COP as a representative of the Brazilian grassroots, and has amazing experience to share and insight that, well, almost nobody else has. It's pretty unique. And we hope you'll join us. And thank you, Helena, for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you both, Anya. Yeah. Thank you to both.
Well, bye from us at Local Futures. And we hope you have a good time and that you can take away some gold nuggets from here. Bye.